Welcome to the Life Beat podcast, a One Joshua Group production, providing access to information and experts to improve quality of life and health outcomes.
So what if what we've learned as being conventional wisdom about Alzheimer's may have a different slant? And what if this may have become lore rather than fact? What do you say about that?
Well, that is a major part of my arguments in the last 25 years, that we've adopted a myth of Alzheimer's disease, that it's caused by the pathology. And we've tested it in recent studies. We removed the pathology in people, and they didn't have a miraculous cure. They might have had a slight change in their cognitive drop, but they didn't get better. And the change is really minuscule, if it even exists. So, and on the other hand, people are not questioning it, which is a problem. Not questioning, when in fact there's other data which really shows Alzheimer's disease can be dealt with in a positive way. And a lot of that's come out of health disparities research.
So you're listening to Dr. George Perry. George Perry is the Sims Foundation Distinguished University Chair in Neurobiology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Dr. Perry, is that right?
That's correct. And I'm really delighted
right
to the Sims family's support over the years.
Yeah, that's very important, especially in the current climate. So I I thank you for, I had to get that in. I thank you for that. So Dr. Perry is joining us to talk about something that's personal for me and probably many other of those of you who are listening to Life Beat, the podcast series. One Joshua Group is extremely honored to have my friend, Dr. George Perry, share with us information about Alzheimer's disease and those things that are related to it. So, Dr. Perry, let's get to the rudimentary discussion here. What is Alzheimer's?
Well, before I do that, I really want to thank you very much for this honor. Our friendship has been one of the great treasures in my academic personal career, and I really admire all you're doing for our community. What is Alzheimer's disease? Well, Alzheimer's disease first was described in 1906 as a disease of a middle-aged woman in her 50s who had cognitive loss. And in her case, she also had some psychotic changes. And when she died, her brain was examined, and she had 2 lesions of the disease, Plaques and Tangles. And you could say, wow, we've really advanced a lot from 1906. But the 1906 description still is what guides people. People still use the Plaques and Tangles as a diagnostic tool or biomarkers related to them in fluids, or they use the psychotic changes, the mental loss, higher cognitive abilities. And further, the big definition change was understanding that the changes of a 50-year-old were the same or similar to people when they're in their 70s and 80s, which is where most people will develop Alzheimer's disease. With realizing it's a disease of aged people also, we move from a rare condition, because very few people have onset in the 40s and 50s, most of which have genetic predisposition, to a sporadic disease where there's no genetic predisposition, and one of the most common conditions leading to death. It's estimated to be the 6th cause of death in the United States. Probably over 6 million people are affected in the United States. So it's a major public health issue. And so back to that is Alzheimer's disease at a global view. Defining it for an individual actually can be more difficult because you have, especially at advanced age, which means over 85, you end up with a lot of changes of aging that are quite similar, complicating the issue.
So to learn that Alzheimer's is the sixth leading cause of death certainly makes it a public health issue. I don't know that I've heard it elucidated to that extent. So that's something that we can remind our viewing and listening audience about paying attention to Alzheimer's. Now, the other big question, Dr. Perry, what is the relationship of dementia to Alzheimer's?
Dementia is the broad category of cognitive loss, and you can have that at any age. Let's say you suffer a traumatic injury. You could have loss of cognition, either temporary or permanent, from head trauma, a car accident or something like that. A stroke could cause cognitive loss depending what area that the brain is affected. You could be a child and have dementia if you have genetic conditions in which the brain doesn't develop normally. So if you were looking at age-related cognitive loss, age-related dementia, and that is after the age of 60, about 60%, maybe 70% of it's related to Alzheimer's disease. There are other conditions that also can lead to cognitive loss. Parkinson's disease sometimes leads to cognitive loss. ALS, motor neuron disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, sometimes leads to cognitive loss. More common is Lewy body disease, which is similar to Parkinson's, but different, and clinically distinct also, and frontal temporal dementia. So those are just some of the few, but compared to Alzheimer's disease, they're far less than half.
Now, Dr. Perry, you mentioned as early as 1906, we saw this disease, and so I believe that our standard has not changed significantly since 1906. What about your premise about what causes Alzheimer's versus what we believe to have been one of the primary causes of Alzheimer's?
From 1906, Alzheimer and other early investigators like Fisher, who was another investigator in the time, actually doing more extensive studies in Alzheimer. They didn't claim that the plaques and tangles caused the disease. That came about later. So there were a lot of studies in that early 1900s phase, relatively few studies in the 1920s, 30s to the 50s, relatively few, maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30 publications per year. And then it just really boosted up in the late 1970s by studies that were undertaken in England that showed that people that were of advanced age, which meant after 65, that they had the same changes described by Alzheimer, plaques and tangles, when they were demented. And that led to an explosion that we're still continuing on. So it was, in some sense, only natural to think, since these things were not there in normal people, at least normal young people, that they might be actually at the root of the problem. And there's been a tremendous focus in removing them. So I always, when my colleagues or competitors or other scientists have ideas, I adopt them. The best way to be novel is to copy other people and then to use their ideas to understand what they really mean. So I went to look for that aspect, particularly looking at oxidative stress, which is the reaction of the air that you breathe with your body, much like rusting. And I can go into that more detail later if people want to. But we found that the plaques and the tangles actually were more associated with a protective response. And we found, for example, that the plaque had antioxidant activity, protecting cells from oxidation, that the tangle had a known antioxidant enzyme associated with it. So based on that and other studies, we came up with the idea that removing plaques and tangles could be detrimental. And when we first suggested this, which is around the year 2000, were we sure? No, we weren't. but we were sure that people should consider it.
Mhm.
That in fact, this was not the right target to remove. It was the right target to understand what it's doing. And I think we've been borne out by the lack of efficacy of plaque removal.
Mhm. So this is one of the few diseases with my limited clinical knowledge where the removal of plaque is detrimental. Usually, removing plaque is beneficial. Is that not correct?
Correct. And we haven't, the demonstration for us is
Mhm.
about this antioxidant activity.
Okay.
In the case of the humans removing, it has not been shown to be detrimental. It's just been shown not to be beneficial.
Beneficial.
But it is associated with some bad things happening in the brain. The brain shrinks. In every study in which plaques have been removed, there's tremendous brain shrinkage.
Hmm. So something else I've learned, I always learn when I talk to you,
Very
Alzheimer's.
kind always.
Alzheimer's is a broader discussion, more age-related. Dementia can occur at any age more frequently. Yes or no? Did I get that right?
Well, all of these dementing illnesses are more likely in aged individuals because there's less reserve. But dementia could occur at any time. It's just a broad category of loss of higher cognition. Alzheimer's disease, there are descriptions of people in their 20s and 30s that have inherited forms of Alzheimer's disease, but they're extremely rare. Most people, if you have no genetic predisposition, that having Alzheimer's disease with an age of less than 60 is extremely rare. At 60, there's a number. At 65, the number doubles. Every 5 years, your chance of having the disease doubles. And that is now known to go all the way out to 100. That you will always have more of a chance of developing it as you become older.
As you age.
And is that true for the other diseases? They have slightly different age distributions, but the ones I mentioned, like frontotemporal dementia or diffuse Lewy body disease, also tend to affect people over the age of 60.
So, George, you mentioned these magic words, inherited, family history. Is that something we should be concerned about with Alzheimer's and dementia?
It may even be a particular concern for African Americans, even a little bit more than average. So there are two types of genes. I'm going to make it for simplicity, really deterministic genes, and those are rare. There are three of those: presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor protein. Mutations in these proteins lead to invariable development of Alzheimer's disease. If you have the mutation, you're going to develop the disease. In most cases, families would know that that disease is in their family because they would have affected members, because the onset's usually quite early, 40s, 50s, maybe early 60s. So they would know, and the penetrance, meaning everybody who has a mutation is going to develop it. They're dominant, so half the people would be affected. It'd be pretty obvious. I mean, unless you're adopted and don't know, your origins, I think you would know about it. For people outside of that, there's another genetic risk factor, and this is why I'm saying about African Americans may be more of an issue, and that's the apolipoprotein E. Apolipoprotein E occurs in three forms: apolipoprotein E2, 3, and 4. African Americans, but it depends where they come from in Africa. I think in studies we've done, it relates to protection from malaria, and the ancestral gene is that the 4 form is more common among Africans, and it is associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So if you have one allele of 4, you're 3 times more likely to develop the disease. And if you have 2 homozygous, you're probably about 10 times more likely. That does not mean you will develop the disease, just probability number. And How common is this gene among the general United States population? It's about little less than 20% of people. But if you looked at people who develop Alzheimer's disease, it's more like 50 to 60% of people contain an ApoE4. So it's definitely a predilection.
So, Dr. Perry,
developing.
you mentioned the continent of Africa and the predisposition and places of origin. Does that occur in some parts of Africa more often than in others, west, east, just a continent?
I don't know the answer. As you probably know, Africa is the most genetically diverse place for humans in the world, because all of us are Africans. It's only when we left is the question, right? Your family left recently. My family left hundreds of thousands of years ago. So I do not know the distribution of ApoE for different countries. West Africa has a lot of malaria. And malaria, people who contain the E4 allele are protected from malaria, much like sickle cell anemia, not as complete. And malaria is a really important genetic selection factor, because most people that die with malaria die as children, right? The adults who live in areas with malaria survive malaria. But if the children die, they don't leave any genes, right? They haven't had children. So there's tremendous selection pressure. And the E4 gene is the original human gene.
So we are privileged to hear this expose from Dr. George Perry at University of Texas, San Antonio. And I want to be sure that I acknowledge George and let him know that the honor is mutual. And one thing about Dr. Perry is he shows up when he's asked. He is genuine in his concern for people. And he does more than just say that. He demonstrates that. And we appreciate the relationship with you, Dr. Perry, but also appreciate the work that you continue to do. Let's talk about treatment, if we would. Are there new, I won't say novel, I'll just say new approaches in the pipeline to the treatment of Alzheimer's and dementia? And also, can we mention the importance of participating in clinical trials as we look at solving, if you would, or at least addressing some of these concerns?
Both aspects are really critical. So there are new treatments coming out that have been approved by the FDA. They are mostly focused on the amyloid removal approach. I've argued in a number of publications that I think these, if you look at the efficacy versus side effects, are not a good blend. Also, you could add in the cost. The cost is really high. Just the drug itself, it's an antibody drug that has to be applied in an infusion center. Just that antibody is about $25,000 a year. You have to have the infusion center, which is another charge, and you have to have MRIs and PET scanning to follow to make sure that you minimize the risk. And the risk associated with these drugs is that you can have cerebral bleeding, which I also wrote about 20 years ago in Science magazine, that I thought that would be one of the complications, because people with Alzheimer's disease don't just develop amyloid as plaques. They develop amyloid in the blood vessels. And when it develops in the blood vessels, it replaces the muscle layer in major vessels, which means that they're weak. And if they're weak, they can break. And that's what happened in a few cases that have been reported, that there was massive cerebral hemorrhage and death to some people. Those people were ApoE homozygotes, but it doesn't mean that there aren't changes even in people without the ApoE, because imaging studies show that there is bleeding as a common sequelae. And as I mentioned earlier, every one of the studies, and there's been 20 some clinical trials, all of them showed brain atrophy. And brain atrophy, brain shrinkage, is a normal part of the aging process, which is not considered to be a good thing because it denotes loss of white matter, loss of axonal connections, loss of neurons, etc. But there hasn't been really a thorough investigation exactly why it's changing. Let's see, you asked another part of this. Let's see, what is new treatment? And then the second part.
Was clinical trials, participating.
Clinical trials are essential to really evaluate because if you want to get the profile, what is the efficacy and what is the risk associated with it? Careful clinical trials are essential, and there aren't enough patients to do most of the studies. So having people volunteering for these, either within universities or other locations, CROs, clinical research organizations, is essential to develop new drugs. And along that line, although the newest drugs are these that remove amyloid, the old drugs actually are more effective. The drugs that are symptomatic. So the new drugs, their claim is they modify the course of the disease. And that remains to be shown. But the older drugs are based on the idea of making the neurons that are still alive more functional. And the classic one of these is Aricept, but there are others. They're cholinesterase inhibitors. And they do provide benefit for patients with very low risk. And low cost.
Cost is important, especially in the current climate. I have to keep saying that. I go to my PCP, my primary care physician, or my healthcare provider, whoever that is. Are there tests that I should ask about my predisposition for Alzheimer's? And I'm going to ask you another question. I'm 73 years old. Are there tests that I need to ask about that I could benefit from knowing the results?
Okay, I've asked this often. I don't share the view. If you're not having cognitive loss, that's a key thing. If you're cognitively normal and you're functioning as you are, would knowing you have a high predisposition to have Alzheimer's disease in the future be a useful thing for you to know? I think each person has to answer it for themselves. Okay? But if you really want to know this, you can do this new blood test that's available. And my understanding, Quest was offering it. I don't know if it's still offered. And it's probably does provide some degree of understanding, okay, what your risk is. But how much value is that? Say you're employed by an employer that then finds out that you're at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease.
Exactly.
Are they going to treat you differently? What can you do having this knowledge? You know, the Alzheimer's Association says you can plan. What do you plan? The advice I would give you if you're at risk of having Alzheimer's disease or not at risk would be actually the same. That is diet, exercise, maintaining connections with people, having a reason to be alive, lowering stress. Those are useful for cardiac disease and everything else. And if you wanted to know your risk, the simplest thing to do is get your ApoE4 genotype. You know, do you have an E4? And then you know it. You don't have to do it again. Your genotype doesn't change through life.
Doesn't change, right.
And the cost is, my 23andMe did it. If they still exist, I don't know. But people at Sequence DNA can offer this test at a minimal cost. I think it's important if you do find out that you have counseling and people to support you with that knowledge. Either way, let's say you find out you're at high risk, you could move into despair. And in essence, all of us are pre-dead anyway, and we manage to go on with our life. So some of us are pre-Alzheimer's. Actually, many of the people who are pre-Alzheimer's are fortunate because they're going to live long enough to develop Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease can also be viewed as a phase of life. I think that's another important thing. If we do live to advanced age into our 80s, there's a high probability we're going to have poor cognition at the end. That doesn't mean we can't function with our families and even contribute to society. I think there's been too much focus on the very, very end stage of Alzheimer's disease, which people are dysfunctional. But prior to then, many of these people are the people you know in your community already.
So I think that that's probably one of the few times I've heard an uplifting message about Alzheimer's and dementia. It's much more and more often not that. And I agree that much of our discussion at the lay level is really towards end of life rather than maintaining and being fortunate enough to be able to develop a response to aging like Alzheimer's. So it's really exciting to hear that we can still function, and that I don't, just because you lose your keys every day or you can't find your phone, that may just does not mean that you and I'm in that category.
Right, as you even if you're normal, within normal cognition, you're going to have cognitive loss. I've noticed that for myself already. Remembering names, etc.
Now, as you were talking, I had this thought. Sometimes I do think so. You talked about
always, Kermit.
the social response or the social contribution to cognition. Did we see, or have we been out of the pandemic long enough to see the impact of isolation on cognition and the contribution to dementia or Alzheimer's from social isolation?
I think that people underestimated the whole issue of COVID and Alzheimer's disease. And I'm not a social scientist, but I was really aghast when I learned that in New York and New Jersey, that so many people in nursing homes are dying of COVID. And I know that almost half the people in nursing homes have Alzheimer's disease. And the reason they often go there is because they have these behavioral problems that make it very difficult for families to manage them. Okay, so I made a plea to some societies related to Alzheimer's disease, not the Alzheimer's Association, some others. I said we really should advocate people keeping track of what happened so we'd have the demographics to understand it. No one seemed to agree with me at this point. So I wrote an editorial pointing this out. And then later on, I developed a collaboration with a woman who's been studying this aspect. And also my own personal issues. So a neighbor of ours who never developed COVID died from isolation. He had Alzheimer's disease. His wife placed him in a nursing home. He was isolated. He deteriorated, died rapidly. Another neighbor, her mother, was in an assisted living place. COVID came. She was slightly demented. She became isolated. She died within a few months. So neither of those people had COVID. And yet they died during that period. So if you just look at the COVID data, which is what studies I've done in collaboration with Rong Zhu, people are twice as likely that have had Alzheimer's disease are twice as likely to have died of COVID, and vice versa. People that had COVID are twice as likely to transition into Alzheimer's disease in the next year. And there's no genetic predisposition that sets this up. So we really underestimated how much impact social isolation and further the death pattern of people with Alzheimer's disease as similar comorbidities. The terminal phase usually associated with respiratory failure. What is COVID? Respiratory failure. So of course the two are going to be synergistic.
So my personal experience, my mom has dementia. And We did not discover that until COVID. During COVID, my dad had passed. She was living at home alone. And we thought things were going on as normal. They were very routine until we began to pay attention that they were so routine that her responses were routine. We got the same responses to the questions regardless of what we asked. And it was because of that isolation. I think because not being able to be amongst other people, to have the stimulation, I think, of humans, those things that are so important, the quality of life issues, regardless of the cognitive decline, the impact of being able to relate to other people is so critically important. I want to ask you this as we talk about this journey within Alzheimer's and dementia. What do you think is an optimistic prediction about Alzheimer's and its treatment for the future?
The most optimistic thing, and I think there's been, initially I concentrated on kind of the biomedical approach.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, there's some evil thing in the brain and we need to get it out. You can actually find that throughout many diseases. The other approach, the more holistic approach, has happened over the same time period, the last 25, 30 years. And it's come up with the idea that Alzheimer's disease may be a lot like heart disease, multifactorial. There are genetic contributions. There are ethnic contributions, maybe more related to lifestyle issues between different groups. But it isn't one thing and there isn't one treatment. So some of this was disclosed, as I hinted at earlier, by health disparities, because African Americans are more prone to have Alzheimer's disease, and Hispanic Americans are also. Actually, very few studies report this, but some have shown that this really is related to socioeconomic differences. I mean, that's always my claim. I said, well, why don't we have people from Appalachia as part of this curve also to understand how it really does. But this difference is really striking. So at age 85, African Americans, 60% of them would be affected by dementing illness, probably mostly Alzheimer's disease, and whites would be more like 25%. So that's a big difference. And then, okay, so that's something, and genetics doesn't explain all of it. Then you come back with intervention studies, and there's been a number of these which have been continually improving, and modifying diet to make certain people get the right nutrients, exercise. And there was a study that we just constituted our award for the best paper of last year, people doing imaging on thousands of brains and looked at those that exercise versus not. Exercise actually makes the brain larger in the key areas. So exercise, and it doesn't have to be huge amounts of exercise either. And nutrition, whether it means eating a lot of, Mediterranean diet might be one example. But for your issue that you mentioned is very clearly also having a reason to be alive, social involvement, people that are contributing to their community still. That meaning their community, meaning their family, their church, their neighborhood. When you take people away from that connection to other people, that leads to depression. And the other part is reduction of stress. Some stress is good, but very often we're overstressed. And, for minorities, there's a lot of evidence that suggests the stress of living in the community, maybe some aspects of, interactions with police, maybe interactions with other people can be more stressful for them than the average. And whether it's real or perceived, it really doesn't make a difference. High levels of stress cause a lot of problems. There are people that have developed this much more than the four things I mentioned. And they claim that they can actually reverse Alzheimer's disease by doing these things. I don't know if that's really been well demonstrated. But let's look at the average 85-year-old person. Your mother, as you mentioned, your father passed away.
Mhm.
She's living alone. Things have changed. Some people, actually, their finances change. They have no connection with other people, and they have nobody to talk to. So all of these things can lead to a cognitive loss. And it's demonstrated actually across the board. When you get involved in clinical trials, just being in clinical trials, getting the placebo will improve your cognition.
Mhm. Mhm.
Why? Because anything that gets you socially involved, right? When you're in the clinical trial, you feel like you're helping the world. Somebody's paying attention to you. And a lot of older people
Mhm.
think about, 100 or 200 years ago, older people lived with families. They may have played a role in taking care of grandchildren or other descendants. They had a reason to be. And I think that's really critical for older
Mhm.
people. And if you're a slight bit demented in the early phases, you can
Mhm.
clearly be involved with family. A friend of mine, Peter Whitehouse, developed a school, an intergenerational school, in which he has all sorts of older people volunteering to help children,
Mhm.
including older people with dementia.
So we've been joined today by Dr. George Perry, who's the Sims Foundation Distinguished University Chair in Neurobiology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Dr. Perry, as always, it is our pleasure to talk to you now. George says he's not a social scientist, but I will tell you that you have to have the kind of compassion that Dr. Perry has to be able to look beyond what is the obvious. And we thank you for joining us for Life Beat, the podcast magazine. I'm Kermit Payne, and remember to be kind to yourself and be kind to others.
We would love to hear from you. Send your listener letters, questions, and topic requests to media@the1jg.com. Life Beat, the podcast, is sponsored by One Joshua Group, your strategic source for engagement to improve life through better health, education, and information. To learn more, visit us at the1jg.com or follow our work on social media using hashtag 1JGCollabs. One Joshua Group, advancing access to healthcare and education by joining what you know with what we've learned.